I'm Tracy Sable. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, public appearance. The Holy Father holds his first main event since leaving the hospital late last week. Meeting in China. The U.S. Secretary of State is in Beijing for high-level talks. We're at the White House. Standing together. Why thousands of people gathered Friday to protest the Los Angeles Dodgers. And listen to this. 7 tips for modern fathers from St. Joseph. We'll explain. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us. Our top story tonight, Pope Francis made his first public appearance since leaving the hospital late last week. He did it during his traditional Sunday message to pilgrims in St. Peter's Square and reminded the faithful that God is with us even in our most difficult times.
La vicinanza di Dio, la vicinanza di Gesù.
The Holy Father also says staying close to God will help us conquer every fear, and he expressed his profound gratitude to everyone who prayed for him during his hospital stay. He says the affection, care, friendship, and prayers helped his recovery from his 3-hour abdominal surgery. Well, since leaving the hospital, the Holy Father also met with a group working on the Eucharistic Revival Initiative. EWTN Vatican Bureau Chief Andreas Thonhauser has more.
We're here in Rome in front of the Vatican, and with me is Bishop Andrew Cozzens, who is just coming from the Apostolic Palace, where he led a delegation for the National Eucharistic Congress, which will take place next year in the United States. He led this delegation to meet the Holy Father and to bless the monstrance that will be used at this Eucharistic Congress. Thank you for being with us. Can you tell us a little bit, how was the encounter with the Holy Father?
You know, it was a really great gift to be with the Holy Father, and he's just out of the hospital, but he was actually very energetic, and you really sensed his passion for what we're doing in the Eucharistic Revival and in the National Eucharistic Congress. He gave us a beautiful speech, and you could just sense his emotion and his passion. And of course, we did bless the 4-foot monstrance, and so he mentioned how grand it was, how tall it was, and also a chalice and a paten that will be used at the Eucharistic Congress as well.
He also went off script in his address to you and your delegation. What did he say there?
Yeah, he gave us a beautiful address, but there were 3 moments when he kind of emphasized things. One, he said, we've lost a spirit of adoration in the world today, and we need to reteach people that spirit of adoration, especially spending time in adoration in silence with the Lord in the Eucharist, which was such a beautiful insight and how true, and something we've really tried to do in the Eucharistic Revival. He also mentioned that we need to be missionaries, and this is really what we've been about in the Eucharistic Revival, to have a missionary conversion, right? And he said, we have to receive communion, we have to adore him, but then he said we have to go out and we have to tell others about the good news. And thirdly, he specifically mentioned the connection between the Eucharist and the poor, and how the Eucharist, when we go out, makes us go to the poor. And he said, especially don't forget the elderly and the sick. You'll find Jesus in the elderly and the sick. What a beautiful message for us. As our group this afternoon will go visit Mother Teresa's sisters to learn more about that connection between the Eucharist and the poor.
And I understand you will bring back the monstrance to the U.S., but before that you'll also go to Assisi. Why is that?
Yeah, we're making a whole pilgrimage this week to ask the blessing of Peter and Paul on our Eucharistic Congress, but also we're going to Assisi. We're going to encounter the mother of Blessed Carlo Acutis there and actually get to pray at his tomb. And he's been one of the patrons of our Eucharistic Congress because he was a young man on fire with love for the Eucharist.
And can you tell us a little bit more what we are to expect from the Eucharistic Congress?
You know, it's going to be a great moment in the United States. We have these pilgrimages beginning from the 4 sides of the United States. We will pilgrimage with the Blessed Sacrament to Indianapolis, and it'll be 4 nights, 3 days, where we'll have beautiful talks about the Eucharist, incredible masses, times for adoration, really an opportunity for the church to come together and encounter the Lord together, and then to be set on fire, because we want that fire to go back to all the parishes in our country where we want this missionary spirit to continue.
Bishop Andrew Cozzens, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you also for your testimony for the Eucharist. It was wonderful having you with us.
Thank you, and we're so grateful for EWTN's cooperation and collaboration in this great movement.
Well, back here in the United States, it has been almost a year since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, and Democrats have been trying to chip away at the ruling, even now proposing measures that go beyond the court's decision. Their latest bill seeks to codify access to contraceptives. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales has that story. Eric?
Well, good evening, Tracy. More than 50 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court recognized the right to contraception. Democrats say the court's decision last year to overturn Roe is a direct threat to other privacy rights. They want to pass the Right to Contraception Act, which would make access to birth control and abortion-inducing drugs the law of the land.
People are using birth control. And so if we can talk sense into some of these people and stop the misinformation and help them understand that if, frankly, for those who are so concerned about abortion, we should be handing out birth control on street corners.
Democrats say almost all women use some type of birth control during their lives and claim more than 90% of voters support having access to FDA-approved contraception.
The right to contraception is central to life, liberty, and economic and social freedom. It is essential to equity for Black, Brown, Indigenous, LGBTQ, rural, immigrant, low-income, and disabled Americans. And it is a right that we have a moral duty to protect.
But Republican Chris Smith, Congressional Pro-Life Caucus Chair, tells me the bill is another example of the Democrats' disdain for pro-life Americans.
The ugliness, the cruelty, and the hostility towards people, particularly people of faith, particularly the Catholic Church and other faith-based entities, the facade will come off.
The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is also sounding the alarm. In a letter to lawmakers, the bishops wrote, quote, "Far from being a bill that simply allows for access to contraception, this bill seeks to bail out the abortion industry, trample conscious rights, and require uninhibited access to dangerous chemical abortion drugs." Democrats insist that they will continue to push for more pro-abortion measures in Congress.
No matter the hurdles, no matter what extremists throw at us, Democrats will never back down from our defense of justice and freedom for all.
Right now, the future of the bill is uncertain. Last year, the House narrowly passed a similar measure, with most Republicans opposing it, but the bill failed in the Senate. I'll continue to stay on top of this issue. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
Well, amid strained relations between the United States and China, Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Chinese President Xi Jinping today. The question was anything achieved? White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
Tracy, President Joe Biden is in California today. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, all eyes on that meeting between Secretary of State Blinken and China's president. Trade, Taiwan, human rights, the South China Sea, Russia's war in Ukraine, and the shootdown of that Chinese spy balloon earlier this year, among the issues raising tensions between both nations. At the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken shakes hands with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The United States and China have pledged to stabilize their badly deteriorated ties. Later, Secretary Blinken told reporters in a news conference,
"There are many issues on which we profoundly, even vehemently, disagree. We will always take the best course of action to advance the interests of the American people."
Secretary Blinken also brought up wrongfully detained U.S. citizens, as well as a deadly drug killing Americans.
I raised as a priority the issue of synthetic opioids and fentanyl, a crisis in the United States. Fentanyl is the #1 killer of Americans aged 18 to 49.
President Joe Biden also traveling today, flying to California to announce $600 million for climate adaptation projects before holding campaign fundraisers. The president held his first re-election rally this past weekend, speaking to union members in Philadelphia.
I'm proud to say the word. I'm proud to be the most pro-union president in American history.
While Republican candidates seek to unseat President Biden, they're also taking jabs at each other. Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie calls former President Donald Trump a three-time loser.
Loser in 2018 by losing the House, loser in 2020 by losing the White House and the United States Senate, and the worst midterm performance we've seen in a long, long time.
Name calling aside, the former president for now has an excellent shot at becoming the GOP's nominee next year, even raising millions of dollars post-indictment. Now, back to those talks in China. After meeting with President Xi, Secretary Blinken said China is not ready to resume military-to-military contacts, something the U.S. considers crucial to avoiding miscalculation and conflict, particularly over Taiwan. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
Joining us now is Mike Davis, founder and president of the Article 3 Project. Mike, great to be with you again. A lot to talk about, but first, let's start with Secretary of State Antony Blinken's meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, a crucial meeting at a crucial time. That said, what do you think will come from it? And also, with the stakes this high, some may wonder why it wasn't President Biden himself meeting with President Xi. Your thoughts?
Well, I think President Biden has shown the world that America is weak right now under his leadership. We have Russia exploiting Biden's weakness by trying to take Ukraine, and we have China getting aggressive with Taiwan, and it's just not a good place for America to be. This never happened under President Trump's watch for 4 years.
Well, Mike, speaking of President Trump, back here in the United States, a new Rasmussen poll shows that President Biden is trailing former President Trump by about 6 points when it comes to the 2024 election. This despite Trump's indictment on federal charges. Mike, what do you think this signals?
I think it signals that the American people understand that the American people, not D.C. insiders, get to pick the President of the United States. And with Alvin Bragg's indictment of President Trump in New York, the Democrats sealed President Trump's primary victory. And with Jack Smith's indictment of President Trump down in Florida, I think that Merrick Garland and Joe Biden have sealed President Trump's election back into the White House.
Meantime, a judge ruled today that former President Trump and his team cannot publicly disclose any of the evidence against him when it comes to this indictment. What more do you know about this, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, this is a pretrial order. My concern is there is a Sixth Amendment right for the defendant to have a public trial. Now, granted, Trump's lawyers did agree to this protective order, but there's also a First Amendment right for the American people, including American press, to have public access to these trials. So I hope they don't think that they're going to try to take out a presidential candidate behind closed doors and the American people don't get to see the process and don't get to see that it's a fair process. I also have concerns that this magistrate judge, Bruce Reinhart, who had recused from President Trump's civil lawsuit against Hillary Clinton before the Trump raid, based upon this magistrate judge 2017 Facebook post trashing President Trump, somehow that judicial bias went away when Reinhart ordered this unprecedented raid back in August, and somehow it's still gone away when he's on this case. I don't understand why this magistrate judge is on this case.
Yeah, and where do you see, this all going? Do you think it'll eventually derail former President Trump from running for the White House?
No, I actually think it's going to guarantee that President Trump is back in the White House in January 2025. These are bogus political charges as part of the Democrats' lawfare campaign against President Trump because they fear that they cannot beat him in the next election. So they're simply trying to indict him and put him in prison to die. And that's what Garland is doing with these charges. They are ignoring the Presidential Records Act, where the president and former presidents have the absolute right to access their presidential records. And they're ignoring that and charging President Trump under this bogus theory of espionage. Jack Smith, Garland's hand-picked special counsel, is used to getting overturned unanimously by the Supreme Court, like Jack Smith did when he got a bogus conviction of potential Republican candidate in 2016, Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. He got reversed 8-0. It would have been 9-0, but Justice Scalia passed away before the decision was issued.
Mike, we have about 30 seconds left or so, but quickly, what else are you following?
Well, I think what is important here is this criminal indictment of President Trump, this bogus criminal indictment of President Trump, is unprecedented, and it is illegal what they're doing. The president has the right to his presidential records under the Presidential Records Act. There is no evidence whatsoever that President Trump intended to harm the United States by having his presidential records. This is bogus, and the American people should have a say in this next presidential election, not Garland and Jack Smith.
Well, Mike, great to be with you. Always appreciate your insights. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we have a lot more still to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including targeting the faithful, an update on the persecution of Catholics in Nicaragua, and tips for fathers from St. Joseph. Church in Spain, where a priest was stabbed back in 2020, has now been vandalized and robbed. The incidents took place last week at St. Jose Maria Escriva Parish near Madrid. Church officials say there was a great deal of damage inside, but the tabernacle was untouched. And in Nicaragua, the bank accounts of several priests have been frozen. A human rights expert says the clergy were told earlier this month, adding that he expects more priests and lay people will be targeted by President Daniel Ortega. In May, the government accused church officials of various crimes, including money laundering. And at least 4 Palestinians were killed by Israeli troops as clashes in the West Bank continue. Israeli troops came under massive exchange of fire during an arrest raid. A military vehicle was hit by a roadside explosive device planted by Palestinian militants, wounding at least 45 people. Israel says the attack may impact military strategy in the future. The Kremlin says it is unsafe for United Nations workers to visit the site of the collapsed dam in Ukraine, adding that the spring offensive by Ukrainian troops makes any visits there dangerous. The UN says that it is working with both sides to gain access to that area. Well, North Korea is vowing to try once again to launch a spy satellite after a failed attempt last month. Pyongyang says that it may take several weeks to determine what went wrong with the first launch. The satellite would help North Korea better monitor the United States and neighboring South Korea. It would also be an important step in modernizing the country's military. Up next on EWTN News Nightly, a slippery slope analysis of a measure in California that could threaten parental rights, plus advice for dads from the patron saint of fatherhood. We'll explain. Thousands of people, including many Catholics, gathered Friday night for a peaceful protest against the Los Angeles Dodgers for their decision to honor a controversial transgender group that mocks Catholics. Fans sang Ave Maria outside Dodger Stadium. Inside, about an hour before the game started, the Dodgers presented the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence its Community Hero Award. Meanwhile, there were other forms of prayer and protest on Friday, including a special mass celebrated by Archbishop Jose Gomez. Also in California, lawmakers have advanced a measure that would make it illegal for a parent to speak out against their child's desire to change genders. The bill would classify gender affirmation for children as, quote, essential health care. Any parent who does not affirm transgenderism for their child could be guilty of abuse. According to local media reports, the proposal is now headed to the state Senate for debate and a vote. And we go now to Tony Kinnett, investigative columnist for the Daily Signal, who has been following this story. Tony, great to have you on today. Tell us a little bit more about this bill and why even apparently some Democrats have issues with it.
So AB 957 was originally a bill that was just going to require California judges to take whether a parent is gender affirming to a child into consideration. Yet Senator Scott Wiener, once the bill reached the Senate, completely rewrote the bill. He made it an amendment to the California Family Code, which, as you said, now requires parents to affirm their child's gender. And if not, they are withholding essential care for their child, which could hold not only just a parent, but a local business, a church, a hospital, in liability for child abuse based on withholding this from a child. And the catch is why even some Democrats have concerns is that there's really no definition for affirmation. There's no standard for whether you're being affirming to a child's transition or not. Of course, all of those are completely new terms anyway. There's no set standard in court precedent. And so although the Democrats in the California Senate Judiciary Committee had concerns over the language, they ended up voting for it anyway.
Tell us a little bit more about the lawmaker Wiener. I hear he's a controversial figure himself.
Senator Scott Wiener is quite the character. So he was the one who wrote the California bill that Newsom signed into law that made California a sanctuary state for operating on minors for transgender-based surgeries and procedures. He's also worn some interesting clothing, we'll say, to a lot of local pride events. He also gave an award to the store you just mentioned, the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, that Catholic hate group. So he's a very interesting individual. He has claimed in the Senate Judiciary Committee that the only reason people don't like the bill is because he's gay, which, given that several of the testimonies against the bill were from gay individuals themselves, that's not a very strong point, but that does seem to be what he's going with.
So tell us, has this bill gotten any pushback from any groups?
Absolutely. And what's really amazing is seeing the number of testimonies against AB 957 as opposed to for it. While I was watching the Judiciary Committee, there were 17 people who testified in favor of the bill. Over 120 people called in, came to testify against the bill, and people from every tribe, tongue, and creed. A very diverse group that came to push against the bill, several languages spoken in opposition, especially Armenian and Hispanic parents. And it's very unpopular among a lot of people in California. That message just doesn't seem to have reached the Democrat-controlled California legislature.
Yeah, and I understand it has something to do with parental rights when it comes to divorced parents. What more can you tell us about that?
Well, California, before, there were judges who took into consideration how a child was treated at home. Yet in this circumstance, a judge in California would be required to confirm or deny whether a child was being gender affirmed. Again, that's a very loose term. In a custody case, meaning if you're the parent who disagrees with the other on whether a child should be gender affirmed in their transition, then the judge would be forced to rule in favor, regardless of other extenuating circumstances, in favor of the parent who was gender affirming in that custody case. So this is obviously a very serious problem for a state that already has trouble when it comes to assigning custody cases. And of course, I'm talking about a state that is more likely to put a child in foster care rather than to award custody to, for example, a single father.
Tony, I know you're going to be on this and continuing to follow this. I want to pivot now to something a little different. Yesterday was Father's Day, as we all know, and National Public Radio published an article that received quite a bit of heat for featuring a so-called transgender dad who got pregnant. Tony, I want to get your thoughts on that and the message that you think this sends.
Well, NPR is floundering as it is. It's lost 7 million monthly viewers in the last couple of months since it decided to run away from Twitter when it started to receive open criticism. But when it comes to NPR's articles, we'll say, more like glorified blog posts, it's hilarious to see an organization that once used to found definitions very specifically, speaking as a teacher who used to listen to it regularly, now to see them pulling what seems like a grab bag of today's accepted vocabulary, making Father's Day about someone who got pregnant, making Mother's Day about birthing persons, talking about why it's important for kids to learn about kink, and the various other things that NPR has desisted into is, again, it just seems like an organization that is floundering for attention. And I'm glad to see them receiving heat for this. They're completely irrelevant as a news organization. They have been for some time.
Well, Tony, we're going to leave it right there. Thank you so much for coming on today and weighing in on everything. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Tracy.
Finally tonight, an article in the National Catholic Register has 7 bits of advice for fathers, grandfathers, and even godfathers from St. Joseph. Among the tips are accept what God allows to happen, be humble, do your work diligently, and be a protector of your family. For all 7 bits of advice, visit our partners at ncregister.com. And we thank you for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sable. Good night, and God bless.